Millionaire sees his late daughter's sketch. Hanging in a street artist's stall, what he learns next breaks him. Edward Collins froze mid-stride, the bustling weekend market of Washington Square Park fading into a distant hum around him. At 40, the tech millionaire had perfected the art of filtering out distractions. Business calls during dinner, emails during meetings, and especially street vendors hawking their wares. Yet now, something had pierced his carefully constructed bubble of isolation. Before we dive deep into this tear-jerking story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It's free, as your support helps us create more meaningful stories for you. Enjoy the story. There, pinned casually among dozens of sketches fluttering in the autumn breeze, was Lily's face. His heart slammed against his ribs as the world tilted on its axis. Not a photograph, a drawing. Lily as a princess, a delicate crown nestled in her dark curls, her unmistakable amber eyes gazing with wonder at something just beyond the frame. She stood in a garden of fantastical flowers that seemed to be reaching toward her, as if she were the sun they all sought. "That's one of my favorites," came a soft voice cutting through Edward's shock. He blinked, finding himself face to face with a young woman, perhaps mid-20s, with charcoal-smudged fingers and keen eyes that studied him with growing concern. "Sir, are you okay?" she asked, her brow furrowing as she took in the pallor of his face. "This drawing," Edward managed, his voice strange and distant in his own ears. "This girl, how do you—" The question stuck in his throat. The artist, Maya, according to the delicate signature in the corner, tilted her head. "She was just a little girl who sat with me years ago, right here in this park. She described exactly how she wanted to be drawn. A princess in a magical garden." A smile softened her features. "She had the most incredible imagination. I never saw her again, but I never forgot her either." Edward's knees weakened. He gripped the edge of the folding table, the sketch of Lily swimming in his vision as tears threatened. "This is my daughter," he whispered, the words scraping his throat like broken glass. "My Lily." Maya's eyes widened. "Your daughter?" She stopped, confusion replacing her smile. "The little girl from the park is your daughter." Edward nodded, unable to look away from the sketch. The small dimple in Lily's right cheek, the slight upward tilt of her nose, details that no stranger should know, rendered with perfect accuracy by this woman's hand. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the drawing. "Of course." Maya carefully unpinned it from the display board. With trembling fingers, Edward took the sketch, a rush of memories threatening to drown him. Lily spinning in their living room, declaring herself queen of the enchanted forest. Lily building fairy houses from twigs and pebbles in their small backyard. Lily begging him to read just one more princess story at bedtime. "She passed away," he said, the words still sand in his mouth even after 5 years. 5 years ago, she was 10. Maya's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes instantly filling with sympathy. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I had no idea. She was so full of life, so vibrant." "Yes," Edward agreed, a strange sound, half laugh, half sob, escaping him. "She was." The crowd continued to flow around them, oblivious to the seismic shift occurring at this humble art stall. Edward stared at the sketch, at his daughter immortalized not as she had been, but as she had dreamed of being. "She sat with me for hours," Maya said quietly, drawing Edward back from the edge of his memories, describing every detail, the exact shape of the crown, the particular flowers that needed to be in her garden. She told me her father built castles in the real world, but she built them in her imagination. Edward's breath caught. His real estate developments and tech campuses, castles, he'd never made the connection. "Would you—" Edward cleared his throat, struggling to regain composure. "Would you have time to talk? About Lily? About that day?" Maya studied his face, seeming to weigh something in her mind before nodding. "Let me pack up my things. There's a cafe around the corner." 30 minutes later, Edward sat across from Maya at a small table by the window, the sketch of Lily placed carefully between them. Steam rose from their untouched coffees as the cafe buzzed with Sunday morning conversations. "It was my first day trying to sell my art," Maya began, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. "I was ready to give up. No one had stopped all morning, except her. This bright-eyed little girl who planted herself in front of my stall and announced that I was exactly who she'd been looking for." A smile tugged at Edward's lips despite the ache in his chest. "That sounds like Lily." She dictated exactly what she wanted. Not a portrait, but a princess version of herself. She had this whole story about the garden, how each flower represented a different kind of magic. Maya shook her head in wonder. "I sketched as she talked, and honestly, it was the most fun I'd had drawing in years." Edward swallowed hard. The weekend before the accident, he'd cut short their park outing because of an urgent call. He'd handed Lily $20, told her to stay where he could see her, and proceeded to pace the pathways, phone pressed to his ear, only half aware of his daughter's whereabouts. Was that when she'd found Maya? While he'd been negotiating a deal that now seemed meaningless? "After she left," Maya continued, "I realized she'd rekindled something in me. I started drawing again with purpose, and whenever I felt lost, I'd draw her, this princess who appeared out of nowhere and reminded me why I became an artist." Edward stared at the sketch, a vice tightening around his heart. "I never knew she did this. I was probably on a call, working, always working." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with regret. Maya's eyes softened with understanding, but held no judgment. "She spoke about you, you know. Said her dad was a king who built magical kingdoms, but sometimes forgot to visit the ones in her imagination." The words struck Edward like physical blows. He looked away, out the cafe window where pedestrians hurried past, their faces blurred through the glass. How many times had Lily invited him into her world? How many times had he smiled distractedly, patted her head, and told her, maybe later? "I was so focused on providing for her future," Edward said, his voice barely audible above the cafe's gentle hum. "After her mother died, I doubled down on work. I thought I was doing the right thing." He ran a hand over his face, feeling the stubble he hadn't bothered to shave that morning. "I was going to give her the world, but I missed the one she was creating right in front of me." Maya reached into her portfolio and withdrew a leather-bound sketchbook. "She's not the only princess sketch I've drawn, but she was the first and always my favorite." She opened the book, carefully turning pages filled with variations of Lily as a princess. Lily in a forest glade, Lily beside a unicorn, Lily reaching for stars that seemed to bend toward her fingertips. "These all became part of a series I call The Princess Chronicles," Maya explained. "They're my most popular works. People connect with them, though they don't know the story behind them." Edward studied each drawing, his throat constricting at how alive Lily seemed in every sketch, how her essence had been captured by a stranger who'd spent only hours with her. "It's remarkable," he whispered. "You've kept her alive all this time, without even knowing." "I've always wondered what happened to her," Maya admitted. "I thought maybe she'd moved away, or just outgrown the princess phase." She hesitated. "May I ask how she passed?" Edward's jaw tightened, the familiar tension creeping up his neck. "Car accident. She was on her way to school. A truck driver fell asleep at the wheel, crossed the median." He recited the facts with practiced detachment. "I was in Singapore, closing a deal. Couldn't even get back in time to—" His voice broke and he cleared his throat. "To say goodbye." Maya's eyes glistened with tears. "I'm so sorry." A heavy silence settled between them, broken only by the clink of cups and the hiss of the espresso machine. I'm selling my company, Edward said abruptly, moving away from the city. There are too many memories here. He tapped the sketch of Lily. Would you consider selling this to me? Name your price. Maya's expression shifted, a shadow passing over her features. I'm sorry, but I don't sell originals from this series. They're special to me. Edward blinked, momentarily taken aback. People didn't say no to him, not when he was willing to pay. I understand you're attached to them, but this is my daughter. Surely you can make an exception. It's not about money, Maya said gently. These drawings marked a turning point in my life as an artist. I exhibit them, but they're not for sale. A flicker of irritation sparked in Edward's chest. What right did this stranger have to his daughter's image? $5,000, he said, his businessman's instincts taking over. Maya's expression hardened slightly. I'm sorry, Mr. Collins. That's not possible. 10,000. The words came out sharper than he'd intended. Maya gathered her sketchbook, closing it with deliberate care. I should get back to my stall. She hesitated, then added, I understand this must be overwhelming for you. If you'd like to see the other pieces in the series, you're welcome to visit my studio, but I won't be selling them. Edward struggled to control the desperation rising within him. This woman, this stranger, possessed something priceless, tangible connections to Lily's dreams, evidence of a side of his daughter he'd failed to fully appreciate in life. And she was denying him. Here's my card, Maya said, sliding a simple business card across the table. Call me if you'd like to see the rest of the collection. After she left, Edward sat alone, staring at the simple white card. Maya Rivera, artist, followed by a phone number and an address in Brooklyn. Beside him, the chair where she'd sat still held the lingering scent of charcoal and something floral. Lilacs, perhaps. He slipped the card into his pocket and left the cafe, his footsteps heavy as he made his way back to his penthouse overlooking Central Park. The apartment, all sleek lines and minimalist furnishings, had never felt like a home. It was a statement, an achievement, not a sanctuary. Down the hall, behind a closed door he rarely opened, lay Lily's room, preserved exactly as it had been 5 years ago. The princess canopy bed with its purple tulle, the bookshelf overflowing with fairy tales and fantasy worlds, the craft table cluttered with half-finished projects. Today, for the first time in years, Edward turned the handle and stepped inside. The air was still, the room meticulously dusted by his housekeeper but feeling undeniably frozen in time. Afternoon light spilled through the curtains, illuminating dancing dust motes and casting a golden glow over Lily's possessions. Edward moved to the bookshelf, running his fingers along the spines of books he'd bought but never read to her. The Secret Garden. Alice in Wonderland. The Little Princess. Stories of magical worlds and brave young heroines. On the craft table, he found colored pencils arranged by color, sheets of paper with half-drawn flowers and animals. Had she been trying to draw princesses too? Had she been creating her own magical worlds on paper that he'd been too busy to notice? His gaze fell on a small wooden box decorated with seashells, a souvenir from their last vacation together in Maine. With trembling hands, he opened it, finding within a collection of treasures only a child would value. Pretty stones, a perfect feather, dried flowers pressed between wax paper, and beneath them all, a folded piece of paper. Edward unfolded it carefully, his heart pounding. It was a crude drawing, clearly made by a child's inexperienced hand, a tall figure with a crown standing beside a smaller figure, also crowned. At the bottom, in Lily's careful handwriting, Daddy the King and Princess Lily. A sob escaped him, echoing in the silent room. Too little, too late, he was finally entering his daughter's world. The next morning, Edward stood outside a weathered brick building in Brooklyn, checking the address on Maya's card against the faded numbers beside the entrance. After a sleepless night spent poring over Lily's belongings, Finding treasure after treasure he'd overlooked, he'd made his decision before dawn. He needed to see all of Maya's sketches, to recapture every fragment of his daughter's imagination that he'd failed to cherish in life. He pressed the buzzer labeled M. Rivera, 3B, and waited, shifting his weight from one foot to another. The intercom crackled. "Yes?" Maya's voice came through, tinny and distant. "It's Edward Collins. From yesterday." A pause, then the buzzer sounded. Edward pushed through the heavy door into a dimly lit hallway that smelled faintly of oil paint and old wood. 3 flights up, Maya waited in an open doorway, dressed in paint-splattered overalls, her hair tied back with a colorful scarf. "I wasn't sure you'd call, let alone come by," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. Edward's gaze swept across the studio apartment, a far cry from his sterile penthouse. Light streamed through massive windows onto wooden floors scarred with years of use. Canvases in various stages of completion leaned against walls. In one corner, a small kitchenette. In another, a bed partially hidden by a painted screen. The space was cluttered but vibrant, alive with color and creation. "I apologize for my behavior yesterday," he said stiffly, unaccustomed to making apologies. "It was overwhelming." Maya's expression softened. "I can only imagine. Would you like coffee?" He nodded, and she moved to the kitchenette while he continued to take in the studio. His eyes were drawn to a large canvas on an easel near the window. A young woman with butterfly wings emerging from a chrysalis, her face caught in an expression between pain and wonder. "Your work is extraordinary," he said, genuinely impressed. Maya returned with 2 mismatched mugs. "Thank you. I've been fortunate enough to make a living from it, though it was touch and go for a while." She gestured to a worn leather couch. "Please, sit. The Princess series is kept separately." Edward settled onto the couch, noticing for the first time the portfolio leaning against a nearby bookshelf. Maya retrieved it and joined him, carefully laying the large black case on the coffee table before them. "I've created 23 pieces in the series so far," she explained, unzipping the portfolio. "Each one inspired by something your daughter described that day in the park." One by one, Maya lifted out the sketches, laying them gently on the table. Edward leaned forward, his coffee forgotten as each new image of Lily appeared before him. Lily riding a dragon, its scales shimmering with iridescent color. Lily standing at the helm of a ship made of flower petals. Lily sleeping peacefully beneath a canopy of stars that had arranged themselves into a protective dome above her. "She described all of these?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Maya nodded. She had this entire world built in her mind. The garden was just the beginning. She told me about the dragon, Sparky, she called him, who was terrified of fire despite being a dragon. About the flower ships that sailed on dewdrops when the world was asleep. She smiled at the memory. She spoke about it all with such conviction, like she'd been there, seen it with her own eyes. Edward swallowed hard, trying to imagine Lily sitting beside this woman, spinning tales of magic and wonder while he paced nearby, absorbed in market projections and quarterly reports. "I never knew any of this," he admitted. "She tried to tell me her stories, but I was always too busy. I thought—" He exhaled heavily. "I thought I was teaching her to be practical, to focus on the real world." "Children need both," Maya said gently, "dreams and practicality." He nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. The last sketch in the series showed Lily, Princess Lily, extending her hand toward a tall, crowned figure whose back was turned. A king who couldn't see her. "This one," Edward said, pointing to it. "This one hurts the most." Maya touched the corner of the sketch. "She told me her father was the wisest king in the land, but he'd forgotten how to see magic. She was determined to remind him." Edward closed his eyes, the pain almost physical. When he opened them again, his gaze fell on a small section of studio wall where several newspaper clippings and photographs were pinned. Among them, a flyer that read, Children's Hospital Annual Art Therapy Program. "You work with sick children?" he asked, grateful for any distraction from his grief. Maya followed his gaze. "Yes, twice a week. Actually, it was inspired by your daughter, in a way. After meeting her, I started wondering how many other children had magical worlds inside them that no one was seeing." Edward stood and moved closer to the wall, examining the photographs of Maya surrounded by children in hospital beds, all proudly displaying artwork. "Do you sell these sketches to fund this work?" "Partially. I display the Princess series at small galleries, and a percentage of any sales from my other works goes to the program." She paused. "That's another reason I can't sell the originals. They're what draws people to the exhibitions." Edward turned to face her, really seeing her, for the first time, not as a roadblock between him and Lily's memory, but as someone who had honored his daughter in ways he never had. "I've been selfish," he said abruptly, "trying to buy these sketches for myself, to keep private. That's not what they're meant for, is it?" Maya studied him, her head tilted slightly. "What do you mean?" "These drawings, they've helped you reach other children, share the magic Lily believed in." He gestured to the hospital photos. "Lily would have loved that. She always wanted to share her stories with anyone who would listen." Something shifted in Maya's expression. Surprise, followed by a cautious warmth. "Most people don't understand why I won't sell them, no matter the price." Edward looked back at the sketches laid out on the coffee table, at 23 different visions of his daughter as she had seen herself. Brave, magical, unlimited by the boundaries of reality. In each one, she was joyful, powerful, free. "I'd like to help," he said, the words surprising even himself. "With your program at the hospital. Whatever you need, supplies, funding, expansion." Maya's eyes widened. "That's very generous, but—" "No strings attached," Edward added quickly, understanding her hesitation. "I'm not trying to buy the sketches anymore. I want to be part of continuing what Lily started with you, helping children be seen, helping them hold on to magic even when the world gets dark." For the first time, a genuine smile spread across Maya's face, not the careful professional smile from the market stall, but something real and radiant. "I think Lily would like that very much." For the next 2 weeks, Edward found himself drawn back to Maya's studio regularly. The sale of his company proceeded with minimal input from him. He had an army of lawyers and executives handling the details, while he immersed himself in a world he'd never expected to enter. The world of art therapy, of children battling illnesses while clinging to their imaginations, of seeing magic where most adults saw only clinical reality. Today, he sat in a corner of the pediatric oncology ward, watching Maya work with a 7-year-old girl named Sophie. The child's head was bare, her skin pallid, but her eyes shone with excitement as Maya helped her sketch a unicorn with wings. "The horn is made of starlight," Sophie explained seriously, pointing to the paper, "and its mane changes color depending on how it feels." "That's beautiful," Maya replied, her voice warm with genuine interest. "What color is it right now?" "Purple, because it's excited to meet you." Maya smiled, adding shimmering strokes of purple to the drawing. "I'm excited to meet it too." Edward observed silently, a tightness in his chest that wasn't entirely painful. These moments reminded him painfully of Lily, yet there was something healing in witnessing the pure, unfettered imagination of these children who faced far greater challenges than most, yet still found space in their hearts for wonder. After the session, as they walked together through the crisp autumn air toward a nearby cafe that had become their routine, Edward found himself opening up more than he had in years. "Lily's mother died when she was 8, he said abruptly. "Cancer, like some of those kids in there." Maya glanced at him, her breath fogging slightly in the cool air. I'm sorry. That must have been incredibly difficult for both of you. Edward nodded, his hands deep in his coat pockets. Rachel was the one who understood Lily's imagination. She would spend hours with her, building fairy houses, making up stories. His lips curved in a sad smile. After she died, I tried to be both parents, but I only knew how to be me. Practical, focused on the future, on security. They reached the cafe and found a table near the window, ordering their usual. Black coffee for him, chai latte for her. You were doing your best, Maya said quietly. Being a single parent is unimaginably hard. Edward stared into his coffee. My best wasn't good enough. I thought I could protect her from more loss by building an empire, securing her future. Instead, I lost the little time we had together. Maya reached across the table, hesitating before briefly touching his hand. The gesture was so unexpected that Edward felt a jolt of surprise. From what you've told me about Lily, I think she knew you loved her, Maya said. Children understand more than we give them credit for. Edward wasn't so sure, but he appreciated the sentiment. He cleared his throat, changing the subject. How much more funding would you need to expand the program to the Children's Hospital in Queens? Maya blinked at the abrupt shift. I haven't really considered it. Maybe $20,000 for supplies, plus compensation for additional teaching artists? She tilted her head. But Edward, you've already donated enough to sustain the current program for 2 years. You don't have to. I want to, he interrupted. It's the most meaningful thing I've done with my money in maybe ever. He paused. Actually, I've been thinking about the future. After the company sale is finalized next week, I was planning to leave New York, but now... Now? Maya prompted when he didn't continue. Edward looked out the window, watching pedestrians hurry past, their collars turned up against the chill. Now? I'm not so sure. There might be more for me here than I realized. The words hung between them, laden with possibilities neither was ready to fully acknowledge. Will you show me? Maya asked suddenly. Show you what? Lily's room, the one you told me about. If it's not too painful, I'd like to see where she lived, the space she created for herself. Edward stiffened, his instinct to refuse immediate and visceral. Lily's room was his private shrine, untouched by outsiders. But as he looked at Maya, this woman who had somehow kept a piece of his daughter alive all these years, the refusal died on his lips. All right, he said instead. Tonight, if you're free. Maya's eyes widened as she stepped into Edward's penthouse that evening, taking in the soaring ceilings, the museum-quality art, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. This is beautiful, she said, but her tone suggested the beauty was distant, admirable rather than comfortable. It's just a place, Edward replied, surprising himself with how true the words felt. 5 years of living here, and the penthouse had never become a home. It was, as Maya's expression suggested, more gallery than sanctuary. He led her down the hallway to the closed door with the small princess crown painted on it. Rachel's work, from before her illness. His hand hesitated on the knob before turning it. I should warn you, it's exactly as it was, he said. I haven't changed anything. The door swung open to reveal Lily's world. The canopy bed with its cloud of purple tulle, the walls painted with a mural of an enchanted forest, the bookshelf overflowing with fairy tales, the craft table still scattered with projects begun but never finished. In the corner, a dollhouse recreation of a castle, populated with small figures arranged in the midst of what appeared to be a royal ball. Maya stepped inside, her movements careful, almost reverent. She ran her fingers lightly over the spines of books, examined the half-completed projects on the craft table, studied the mural with appreciative eyes. This is extraordinary, she said softly. She was surrounded by magic. Her mother's influence, Edward admitted. The mural was Rachel's last project before she became too ill. Maya turned to him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Thank you for sharing this with me." Edward nodded, unable to speak past the constriction in his throat. Watching Maya move through Lily's space, appreciating the details he'd taken for granted, awoke a fresh wave of grief tinged with something else. Gratitude, perhaps, that someone else could see and value what he'd failed to fully appreciate. "May I?" Maya asked, gesturing to the wooden box on Lily's dresser, the same one Edward had examined the night after they'd met. "Go ahead." Maya opened it carefully, examining each treasure within. The pretty stones, the perfect feather, the dried flowers. When she came to the folded drawing at the bottom, she glanced at Edward questioningly. "You can look," he said. She unfolded the paper, and a small, surprised sound escaped her. "Oh," she breathed, staring at the crude drawing of king and princess. "Edward, do you know what this means?" He moved closer, looking at the childish drawing over her shoulder. "That she saw me as part of her world, that she wanted me to be." "More than that," Maya said, her voice vibrant with discovery. "Look at what she wrote at the bottom." Beneath the figures in Lily's careful handwriting were words Edward had missed in his earlier examination. "Daddy the King and Princess Lily in the magical garden where dreams grow into real life." "The magical garden," Maya repeated, turning to him with shining eyes. "Edward, this is the garden she described to me, the one in all my sketches. She was trying to bring you into that world, to show you what she saw." The realization hit Edward like a physical blow, leaving him breathless. All those years, Lily hadn't just been playing. She'd been reaching out to him, inviting him into her world, trying to bridge the gap between them. And he had been too blind to see it. "I need to show you something else," Maya said, her voice gentle but urgent. "Something I've been working on." Edward merely nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. They left Lily's room, Edward closing the door with reverent care behind them. The drive to Brooklyn passed in contemplative silence, the city lights blurring against the night sky as Edward's driver navigated the familiar route to Maya's studio. Inside the warm, paint-scented space, Maya moved directly to a canvas covered with a simple white cloth. It stood separate from her other works, positioned near the window where natural light would hit it first thing in the morning. "After meeting you, after learning who the princess really was, I felt compelled to create something new," she explained, her fingers gripping the edge of the cloth. "I've never done this before. Taken one of the sketches and developed it into a full painting. It didn't feel right until now." She pulled away the cloth, revealing a canvas that stole the breath from Edward's lungs. It was Lily, unmistakably, heartbreakingly Lily, standing in the magical garden, more vivid and alive than any of the sketches. But she wasn't alone. Beside her stood a tall figure in royal blue, a king with Edward's features, kneeling to accept a glowing flower from the princess's outstretched hand. The king's expression was one of wonder and revelation, as if seeing the garden, seeing his daughter, clearly for the first time. "The king remembers how to see magic," Maya said softly, reading the title she'd painted in flowing script at the bottom of the canvas. Edward moved closer, his fingers hovering inches from the painted surface but not quite touching it, as if afraid it might dissolve beneath his fingertips. Every detail was exquisite. The delicate crown nestled in Lily's curls, the flowers that seemed to pulse with an internal light, the look of pure joy on her face as she shared her world with her father. "I started it the night after we met," Maya continued, watching his face carefully. "I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about this little girl who had touched my life so profoundly, and her father who never got to see the magical world she'd created." She paused. "It's yours, if you want it." Edward turned to her, confusion evident in his expression. "But you said the Princess series wasn't for sale." "This isn't part of that series," Maya explained. "This is something new, something that belongs to you, not to me." Emotion clutched at Edward's throat, making speech impossible. He stared at the painting, at this vision of what might have been, father and daughter connected through imagination, through mutual understanding and wonder. "I don't deserve this," he finally managed, his voice raw. Maya's expression softened further. "It's not about deserving. It's about healing." She hesitated, then added quietly, "For both of us. Creating this helped me say goodbye to a princess who changed my life. Maybe having it will help you find a way to say goodbye, too." Edward shook his head, still staring at the painting. "I don't want to say goodbye. That's the problem. For 5 years, I've been frozen, unable to move forward, unable to let go." "Maybe it's not about letting go," Maya suggested. "Maybe it's about carrying her forward differently." The words resonated somewhere deep inside him, striking a chord he hadn't known existed. For 5 years, he'd preserved Lily in amber, her room unchanged, his grief untouched, as if maintaining the pain would somehow keep her closer. "I have an idea," he said suddenly, turning to Maya with newfound purpose. "But I'll need your help." 3 months later, on what would have been Lily's 16th birthday, the Princess Gardens opened its doors for the first time. What had once been the ground floor of an abandoned building in Brooklyn was now a vibrant art space dedicated to children's creativity, with a particular focus on those facing serious illness or trauma. Edward stood near the entrance, watching as children and parents filtered into the airy space filled with easels, craft tables, and comfortable reading nooks. Maya moved among them, welcoming everyone, her face alight with the joy of seeing her vision. Their vision realized. The walls were adorned with art created by children from the hospital program, interspersed with Maya's Princess series, all 23 sketches professionally framed and displayed for public viewing for the first time. At the center of it all, in a place of honor, hung "The King Remembers How to See Magic." "Mr. Collins." A small voice drew Edward's attention downward. Sophie from the hospital stood before him, her head now covered with a fine layer of new hair, her face less gaunt than it had been 3 months ago. "Is it true this whole place is for kids like us?" Edward knelt to her level, meeting her eyes directly. "It absolutely is. What do you think of it?" Sophie looked around, her expression serious as she considered the question. "I think it's magic," she declared finally, "like something from a fairy tale." "The best kind of magic," Edward agreed, smiling despite the tightness in his throat. Across the room, he caught Maya's eye. She gave him a small private smile before returning to her conversation with a group of parents. In the months they'd worked together to create this space, something had shifted between them, a connection forged through shared purpose and mutual understanding that Edward wasn't quite ready to name but recognized as precious nonetheless. The sale of his company had been finalized weeks ago, the proceeds far beyond what anyone had projected. Edward had already established a foundation to ensure the Princess Gardens would continue in perpetuity, with similar spaces planned for other cities. He'd also created a scholarship fund for young artists, with Maya as the head of the selection committee. For the first time in 5 years, Edward was looking forward rather than back. Not forgetting Lily, never that, but honoring her in ways that brought her dreams into the real world, that shared her magic with others who needed it most. A young boy approached him, tugging at his sleeve. "Are you really a king?" he asked, wide-eyed. Edward was momentarily confused, then realized the boy had been studying the central painting. "No," he began, then paused, reconsidering. "Well, not the kind with a country or a castle, just the kind who's learning to see magic again." The boy nodded, accepting this explanation with the straightforward logic of childhood. "My dad's learning too," he confided. "He didn't think my dinosaur could have rainbow scales, but Ms. Maya said it absolutely could." "Ms. Maya is very wise about these things," Edward agreed solemnly. Later, as the opening celebration continued around them, Edward and Maya found a quiet moment near the windows overlooking the small courtyard that would, come spring, be transformed into a real-life version of the magical garden from Lily's imagination. She would have loved this, Maya said softly. All these children creating, imagining, being seen. Edward nodded, his gaze moving from the gleeful chaos of the main room to the painting of Lily that had started it all. "I think," he began, then stopped, gathering his thoughts. "I think this is what she was trying to show me all along, that imagination isn't frivolous, that seeing the world through a lens of possibility and wonder isn't childish, it's essential." Maya's hand found his, her fingers warm and sure as they curled around his own. "The king remembers," she said simply. For the first time in 5 years, Edward felt something like peace settle over him. Not the absence of grief, that would always be part of him, but the presence of something new, purpose, connection, and yes, perhaps even a touch of the magic Lily had so desperately wanted him to see. Spring arrived in a riot of color, transforming the Princess Garden's courtyard into the magical space Edward and Maya had envisioned. Cherry trees burst into pale pink blossoms, while carefully planned flower beds created swirls of color that, when viewed from the second-floor windows, formed the patterns Lily had described to Maya years ago, flowers that seemed to be reaching toward the sun, leaning into each other as if sharing secrets. Edward stood at those windows now, watching as Maya led a group of children through the garden, pointing out different plants and encouraging them to sketch what they saw. The children moved through the space with reverence tinged with delight, some running ahead eagerly while others paused to examine a particular bloom or catch a falling petal. In the 6 months since opening day, the Princess Gardens had become a sanctuary for hundreds of children and their families. What had begun as an art space had expanded organically. A reading program where children wrote and illustrated their own stories. A theater workshop where they could bring those stories to life. A science corner where the magic of nature was explored through microscopes and terrariums. "Mr. Collins." The receptionist's voice drew Edward away from the window. "There's a call for you from Boston Children's Hospital. They're interested in discussing a Princess Gardens installation for their new wing." Edward nodded. "I'll take it in my office." As he walked through the main gallery, he passed the wall they'd named Lily's Legacy, a growing collection of artwork created by children inspired by the Princess series. The images were wonderfully diverse. Princesses of all colors and abilities, princes with wheelchairs or service dogs, magical creatures that defied categorization. Each one bore the unmistakable stamp of the child who'd created it. Heartfelt, imaginative, unique. At the center still hung Maya's painting of Edward and Lily in the magical garden, a beacon that had inspired countless conversations with children about their own relationships with parents who sometimes struggled to enter their worlds of imagination. His office was nothing like the sleek, minimalist space he'd once occupied in his corporate tower. Here, the walls were covered with children's artwork, the furniture comfortable rather than impressive, the windows large and welcoming. On his desk sat a single-framed photograph, Lily at 8, laughing as she rode the carousel in Central Park, her face alight with joy. After the call, which had gone exceedingly well, Edward found himself drawn back to the courtyard. The children had moved inside for lunch, but Maya remained, sketching quietly on a bench beneath one of the cherry trees, pink petals occasionally drifting down to settle in her dark hair. She looked up as he approached, a smile warming her features. In these past months, Edward had come to recognize the different qualities of Maya's smiles, the professional one she used with donors, the patient one she offered struggling young artists, the playful one that emerged during their increasingly frequent dinners together. This smile was different still, unguarded, genuine, meant only for him. "Boston Children's is on board," he said, settling beside her on the bench. "They want to renovate their entire arts program based on our model here." "That's wonderful," Maya replied, closing her sketchbook. "The expansion is happening faster than we anticipated." Edward nodded, his gaze drifting over the garden. "I never expected any of this, you know. That day in the park, when I saw your sketch of Lily, I thought I'd reached the end of something. Instead, it was a beginning." Maya's expression softened, understanding implicit in her eyes. Over these months of working together, of building the Princess Gardens, they'd developed a connection that sometimes made words unnecessary. She could read his moods now, could sense when grief was pulling him under or when he needed to retreat into memories of Lily. "I've been thinking," Edward continued, "about what comes next." "For the Princess Gardens?" "For me." He turned to face her directly. "The foundation is established. The expansion plans are proceeding better than we hoped. The New York space practically runs itself with the team we've built." A flicker of something, concern perhaps, crossed Maya's face. "Are you planning to step back?" "Not exactly." Edward paused, gathering thoughts he'd been turning over for weeks. "When I met you, I was planning to leave New York, to run away from my memories of Lily. Now I understand that wasn't the answer." "What is the answer?" Maya asked softly. Edward gestured to the garden around them. "This, bringing Lily's imagination into the real world, sharing it with others. But there's more I want to do." He hesitated, then pressed on. "I'm establishing a publishing division of the foundation, children's books based on the stories from our workshops here, illustrated by the children themselves where possible." Maya's face lit up. "Edward, that's perfect. The children will be thrilled to see their stories reach an even wider audience." "There's more," he said, his voice taking on an uncharacteristic uncertainty. "I want the first publication to be a special project, a book about a princess who helps a king remember how to see magic." Understanding dawned in Maya's eyes. Lily's story. Edward nodded. "Our story, really. Hers, mine, yours. The story of how a chance encounter in a park changed 3 lives forever." He met her gaze directly. "But I'll need your help with the illustrations. No one else could possibly capture what she imagined." Maya was silent for a long moment, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I'd be honored," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. A cherry blossom drifted down, landing on the open page of her sketchbook, a blank page waiting to be filled with new visions. "There's one more thing," Edward said, his voice steady despite the quickening of his pulse. "Something I've been wanting to ask you." Maya tilted her head slightly, watching him with curious eyes. "These past months, working with you, building this place, it's been the most meaningful time of my life." Edward chose his words carefully, navigating emotions that still felt new and fragile. "You've shown me how to see the world differently, how to honor Lily's memory by living fully rather than just surviving." Maya's hand found his on the bench between them, her fingers warm against his skin. "I care about you, Maya, more than I expected to care about anyone again." The words felt inadequate for the depth of what he felt, but they were an honest beginning. "I'd like to explore what that might mean, if you're interested." A slow smile spread across Maya's face, reaching all the way to her eyes. "I'd like that very much." In that moment, with spring blossoms swirling around them in the garden created from a child's imagination, Edward felt a sensation he'd almost forgotten. Hope, fragile but persistent, taking root in soil long barren. Not replacing what he'd lost, but growing alongside it. Proof that life could still hold beauty and meaning, and yes, even magic. Above them, cherry blossoms continued their gentle descent, like blessings from a princess who had once dreamed of a garden where magical things could happen, and against all odds had made that dream come true. 1 year to the day after the Princess Gardens opened its doors, Edward stood in a back room of Bradbury's, Manhattan's most prestigious bookstore, his stomach tight with anticipation. Beyond the curtained doorway, he could hear the excited chatter of children and parents gathering for the launch of The Princess and the King, the first publication from Princess Gardens Press. Nervous? Maya appeared beside him, resplendent in a dress patterned with delicate watercolor flowers, an echo of the illustrations she'd created for the book. Terrified, Edward admitted with a small smile. Public speaking was never an issue when I was discussing profit margins. This feels more personal, Maya finished for him, straightening his tie with familiar ease. Because it is. Over the past year, their relationship had blossomed alongside their professional collaboration. What had begun as shared purpose had deepened into something neither had expected to find, a connection that honored the past while embracing the future. 6 months ago, Maya had moved her studio into Edward's penthouse, bringing life and color and creative chaos into a space that had been sterile for too long. Together, they had transformed Lily's room from a shrine into a living memorial, still filled with her treasures but now also serving as a creative space where neighborhood children came for art lessons from Maya. The princess canopy bed remained, but beside it now stood easels and a reading nook where young visitors could immerse themselves in stories. "It's time," said the bookstore manager, appearing in the doorway. "We've got a full house." Edward took a deep breath and nodded, feeling Maya's hand slip into his, an anchor in the emotional tide. Together, they stepped through the curtain to applause from the assembled crowd. The children's section of Bradbury's had been transformed for the occasion. Colorful cushions were arranged in a semicircle around a storyteller's chair. The walls were decorated with enlarged prints of Maya's illustrations from the book, showing the princess and the king in their magical garden. At the back of the room stood a group of children from the Princess Gardens programs, beaming with pride at being part of this special day. Edward approached the microphone, surveying the eager faces before him. Among them, he recognized many of the families who had become part of the Princess Gardens community. Sophie, now in remission, her hair grown back into bouncy curls. Tyler, who had overcome his selective mutism through the theater program. Emma, whose prosthetic arm was decorated with painted flowers that matched the ones in the garden. "Thank you all for coming today," Edward began, his voice steadier than he'd expected. "This book represents a journey that began 7 years ago with a little girl who believed in magic, and continued when an artist kept that belief alive through her work." He gestured to the display of The Princess and the King, its cover showing a young girl with amber eyes offering a glowing flower to a kneeling king. "My daughter Lily was that princess. She tried to show me her magical world, but I was too focused on building castles in the real world to see it." Edward paused, gathering himself. "I thought I was teaching her to be practical, but she was trying to teach me something far more important, that imagination isn't just for children, that seeing the magic in everyday life is a gift we too often surrender as we grow older." Maya stepped forward to stand beside him, her presence a quiet strength. "Thanks to an extraordinary artist who met Lily by chance one day in the park," Edward continued, "and who never forgot the princess who shared her dreams, I was given a second chance to enter my daughter's world. Too late for Lily herself, but not too late for her legacy to touch other lives." He gestured to the children from the Princess Gardens. "In the past year, more than 1,000 children have found their voices, their visions, their magic at the Princess Gardens. Today, with the launch of this book, we hope to reach thousands more." The reading that followed was unlike any book launch Bradbury's had ever hosted. Edward and Maya took turns reading passages, while children from the theater program acted out scenes between the princess and the king. When they reached the part where the king finally sees the magic his daughter had been trying to show him, Edward's voice faltered slightly, but Maya's hand on his shoulder steadied him. After the applause had died down and the formal signing was complete, Edward found himself approached by a woman with familiar amber eyes. Rachel's sister, Lily's aunt, whom he hadn't seen in years. "Jessica," he said, surprised. "I didn't know you were coming." She smiled, though her eyes were damp. "Maya invited me. She tracked me down through my gallery in Boston." Jessica hesitated, then added, "I wasn't sure if you'd want me here." Edward felt a pang of regret. After Rachel's death, he'd withdrawn from her family, finding their presence too painful a reminder of what he'd lost. Another mistake among many. "I'm glad you came," he said sincerely. "Lily would have wanted you here." Jessica touched the book in her hands. "This is beautiful, Edward. Truly. Rachel would be proud of what you've created in Lily's memory." "Not just me," Edward said, glancing across the room to where Maya was kneeling beside a young boy, signing his book while listening intently to whatever story he was sharing with her. "I couldn't have done any of this without Maya." Jessica followed his gaze, a knowing smile playing at her lips. "You love her?" It wasn't a question, but Edward answered anyway. "Yes." The admission came easily, without the guilt he might once have expected to feel. "She helped me find my way back to life when I thought that part of my journey was over." "That's how healing works sometimes," Jessica said softly. "It comes from unexpected places, when we least expect it." As the event wound down, Edward found himself standing before the largest illustration from the book, a double-page spread showing the princess and the king planting seeds in their garden, while ghostly images of the flowers to come rose from the soil like dreams taking shape. Maya joined him, slipping her arm through his. "What are you thinking?" Edward considered the question. "I'm thinking about cycles, endings and beginnings, how sometimes they're the same thing." She nodded, understanding as she always did. "The princess story ended, but the garden grew." "Exactly." He turned to face her fully. "I've been so focused on honoring Lily's past that I haven't really thought about my own future. Our future." Maya's expression softened. "And now?" "Now I'm ready." Edward took both her hands in his. "The foundation is established, the book is launched, the princess gardens are thriving. We've honored Lily's memory in ways I never could have imagined. But there's more life ahead, and I want to share it with you." Behind them, the last of the children were gathering their signed books, their faces alight with the magic of story. The Princess Garden's staff were packing up displays, chatting easily with parents who lingered to discuss upcoming programs. A world built from grief and imagination, from a chance encounter and a child's dream. A world that would continue to grow and flourish. "Whatever comes next," Maya said, her eyes shining with promise, "we'll face it together." As they left the bookstore hand in hand, stepping into the golden afternoon light, Edward felt Lily's presence not as a weight of grief, but as a gentle blessing. She had shown him the way back to magic, back to life, back to love, and for that he would be forever grateful. In the courtyard of the Princess Gardens, beneath a cherry tree in full bloom, a small bronze statue stands, a princess offering a flower to a kneeling king, their faces turned toward one another in perfect understanding. At its base, a simple inscription reads, "For Lily, who taught us all to see the magic." "Whatever comes next," Maya said, her eyes shining with promise, "we'll face it together." As they left the bookstore hand in hand, stepping into the golden afternoon light, Edward felt Lily's presence not as a weight of grief, but as a gentle blessing. She had shown him the way back to magic, back to life, back to love, and for that he would be forever grateful. In the courtyard of the Princess Gardens, beneath a cherry tree in full bloom, a small bronze statue stands, a princess offering a flower to a kneeling king, their faces turned toward one another in perfect understanding. At its base, a simple inscription reads, "For Lily, who taught us all to see the magic." As I wrote this story, I found myself unexpectedly moved by Edward's journey from grief to healing. There's something profoundly human about how we sometimes need to lose something precious before we truly understand its value. Edward's redemption isn't about erasing his mistakes or even finding happiness despite his loss. It's about honoring his daughter by finally seeing the world through her eyes. Maya's character emerged as more than just a catalyst for Edward's healing. She became a guardian of imagination, a keeper of dreams that might otherwise have been forgotten. Their connection reminds us that healing rarely happens in isolation. It's through meaningful connections with others that we find our way back to ourselves. Children are like seedlings with their own internal compass for growth. They naturally turn toward their unique light. When we try to bend them to our will, force them into shapes we find more practical or familiar, we risk breaking the very thing that makes them special. Edward's journey teaches us that our role isn't to reshape children's dreams, but to provide the soil and space where their authentic selves can flourish. In the magical garden of childhood, we are not the architects but the caretakers, privileged to witness the wonders that grow when imagination is honored rather than constrained. In the end, this story is about the power of a child's imagination to transform not just her own life, but the lives of countless others long after she's gone. It's about the magic that exists all around us, if only we remember how to see it. Don't forget to like this video if you believe in the power of love to break down walls and bridge any divide. Please do comment your feedback and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of family, redemption, and the triumph of love over pride. Remember, it's never too late to change your story.